Hey folks, Tony here. Today we're going to talk about bulk operations. I have a list of articles over here and I want to allow users to select some of them and hit delete or archive. So there are multiple ways that we can go about implementing this feature. The most common approach I see is to surround the list of elements that we want to perform some operations to in a form. And then we can add some buttons over here, which must be inside the form element as well. So let's implement that first. All right, so let's open that up in the editor. If we check the routes file, we can see that we do have some endpoints for bulk operations. In this case, we have the delete and the archive ones. They are both pointing to the same controller and same action because they are just examples, but you can imagine that this could be doing different things in your application. And they both have different route names. If we check out the implementation, we can see that it's just a regular eloquent find many. We are validating the input. We are expecting a list of IDs and it's required and must be an array. Then we are plugging just the IDs and passing that to find many to find the articles, and then we are calling delete on them. Since this application is using Turbo, if the request was made by Turbo, we'll return a list of Turbo streams to the user that submitted the bulk operation. So we are mapping over the deleted articles and creating remove, so those elements get removed from the DOM. And then we are also returning a flash message to say, hey, these many articles were deleted. If the request wasn't made by Turbo, which means it's a regular HTTP request, we just redirect the user back with the status message. All right, so let's go to the articles index view, and we need to surround the articles list and the actions with a form. So let's do that. Okay, that was easy. Now let's bind the form action to articles destroy all by default. It must be post. And we are adding the CSRF token over here. We don't actually need the CSRF token because Turbo takes care of that. But if the user has JavaScript disabled or if our script broke for some reason, the form should still work. So let's give them that. And over here next to the right button, which is actually a link, we'll add some more buttons so the user can submit the form. And 2 buttons of type submit. The first one will be delete all. The second one will be archive all, and we need to close the brackets. All right, so let's look at it in the browser, and that should be articles. Oh, it should be destroy bulk. Okay, so now let's add the checkboxes over here next to the title. So we have to open the articles card component, and let's surround the article title with a div, a flex item center, space x2. And over here, let's add the input type checkbox. And remember that we need to call this IDs because that's what the controller is expecting. But we'll be sending multiple IDs, so this must be followed by the square bracket to signal that this is an array. And the value of each checkbox will be the article ID. Okay, let's just add some styles over here, make it rounded, and let's see that in a browser. That looks awful. I should have done this. Okay, that's better-ish, I guess. That's as far as we can go about styling. Let's try to click it and nothing happens because we actually have a spawn tag inside the link that is absolutely positioned with inset 0, and the card itself is relatively positioned. So the span inside the link expands to take over the entire card. That's a nice trick that I learned from Adam Watson. We actually need to make this checkbox pop up a little bit. So now we can see that it's sitting above the link itself, so we can select it. All right, so if we submit the bulk operations now, they should work. So that's cool. Let's check the request that we are sending, delete all, and it goes to the articles bulk delete. So that's exactly what we want. And we are sending the ID, so that's cool. If we click on the archive all, we are also sending to the delete action, so that's not exactly what we want. But there is a nice trick over here that we can do. Turns out that submit buttons, they can change some of the attributes of the form. So we can use the form action attribute over here in the submit button, and we can say whenever this form is submitted with this button, we want to override the action, and it's going to send to articles archive bulk. instead of delete. So let's refresh, select some items, and then hit archive. Now they're being sent to the archive endpoint. So that's good. The delete one should still do the delete, the normal delete action of the form. So that's what's doing. So that works, but I don't particularly like this approach because even though it works in our application right now, in a real application, we would have more actions over here. So we could have some forms inside the cards themselves to perform some individual operations on the articles. In this case, we would have a form inside a form, which is not actually a valid thing in HTML. That doesn't actually work. But there is another way, and this is my favorite way. Instead of wrapping everything in a form, let's move the form to just surround the buttons and the closing tag as well. And then we can push everything back. Okay. It's the same form, but it's just wrapping the buttons now. But this is not currently working. So if we check out the browser, we can see that the form is just wrapping the buttons, right? Let's fix this styling. It's driving me nuts. So they are evenly spaced. Okay. So if we select some items now and submit, nothing happens. And that's because our validation is being triggered and it's being redirected back. And this happens because the inputs, they are not actually rendered inside the form we are submitting. So they are not being sent as part of the request. We can check out the request that was made over here, part of the payload. We are just sending the token. However, we can point inputs living in the same document to a form, even though the input is not actually a child of that form. And to do that, we need to give this form an ID. So let's do a articles bulk form. That's a good name. And then we have to go to the checkbox, and then over here we can mark this input and say that this input actually belongs to this form, which is rendered in the same document. It's just not part of the same tree. And if we refresh and try again now, we can see that 2 articles were removed and the IDs are being sent correctly. So that's what we want. Okay, so that's a nice trick. And the buttons trick to change the form action also worked, by the way. Okay, so this is my favorite way. Let's improve the experience over here. Let's disable the buttons because right now the user can click on them and nothing will happen, but they can still click on them. Let's give them some feedback saying that the button is disabled so they can't click on them. And we'll do that whenever there are no selected items. So we are going to create a stimulus controller. I'm not using any build steps, so we are going to create the stimulus controller inline over here. I'm going to call it bulk form. We'll need 2 targets. In stimulus, we can connect DOM elements to the stimulus controller using targets. So let's create the form and the input targets. And whenever this controller is bound to an element, it invokes the connect method. So let's console log the form target. That's how we access the target, and the input targets, because there will be many. The trick here is that we have to connect the stimulus controller with an element that is surrounding both the form and the inputs. And we don't actually have one in this view, but the view is using a layout file, so we can actually bind the controller to the layout like this. And this works because our layout is forwarding the attributes over here. In this case, it's binding to the main tag, but the body would be fine. It just happens to be forwarding to the main tag. All right, let's bind the form target. So bulk form, which is the name of the controller, target, and then we give the name of the target, which is form. This is the name that we are binding this element in the bulk form. Let's also do the same for the checkboxes. So we should go to article. So we should go to article card, and then over here we should say data bulk form target input. Refresh and see what we get. Okay, so this is the form target, and these are the inputs that are bound as targets in the controller. So that's cool. All right, now, all right, so we'll need a stimulus action that will be triggered to update the buttons whenever we check some of the inputs. So let's call it update buttons. All right, so we need to check if any of the bound input targets are selected. And let's add a has. I think it's not selected, it's checked inputs. If there are any checked inputs, we'll call the enable buttons. Otherwise, we'll call the disable buttons. And these methods will be private over here. So let's create them. Enable buttons and disable buttons. All right, so let's start with the disabled one first. So to disable the buttons, we'll get all the buttons this form has, and we'll loop over them, and we'll set the disabled attribute to true. But to enable the button, we'll just call the remove attribute instead. Okay, we don't actually have these properties, so let's create a getter over here, and this will return whatever submit buttons we can find inside this form. So this CSS selector should do. We could use targets. I'm just making it easier for us over here. This doesn't return an array, so we have to wrap it in a array from, and this should work. Okay, so now we are just missing this attribute over here, this property. So let's add it. Remember that we have the list of inputs over here in the input targets attribute. So we just have to check if some of them are marked as checked. They should return true or false, depending on the state of the form. So the first thing that we have to do now is call the update buttons whenever the controller is bound to the DOM. So if there are no checked elements, we can disable the buttons right away. So let's see if that happens. And I don't see any style changes, but the cursor says that if the buttons are disabled, we can check the button itself, and sure enough, we should see the disabled attribute over here on both of them. Okay, so let's just tweak this style a little bit. We go to the button and we say disabled BG gray 400, disabled text gray 50, I don't know, something like that. Let's refresh. And sure enough, we should see the buttons disabled. So now we need to invoke the stimulus action whenever there is a change in the state of the inputs itself. The way to go about this is in our input, we can say whenever there is a change action, let's call the bulk form update buttons method, and let's give it a try. And sure enough, the buttons are enabled. Okay, that's cool. Let's try to use them. And we see the notification, they were removed from the DOM, but something happened over here. They are still enabled. And that's because even though the elements, the inputs were removed from the DOM, the stimulus controller doesn't do anything. So it still thinks that there are some checked inputs because stimulus is not reactive like that. But stimulus allows us to execute some code whenever a target is connected or disconnected from the controller. So we can go to our stimulus controller over here in the private section. Let's create some callbacks for the input target. So input target connected, and then we'll call the update buttons, and we'll do the same for the disconnected. Let's give it a refresh and see what happens. Delete, and sure enough, they were marked as disabled again. And one more thing before we wrap up. Remember that piece of code in the article's bulk controller that's tuple specific? This is the only piece of logic that it's actually tuple related in our bulk operations controller over here. Well, we don't actually need it. Let's remove it and see how the application behaves. Let's open the DevTools and try to delete some articles. And sure enough, our application is working just fine. Instead of returning tuple streams, we are redirecting to the articles page. That's why the page, well, the body gets replaced with a new body from the refreshed list of articles. And this is fine, but we may have other pieces of UI on this articles index page that, you know, have their own state. Like, let's say we had a search form over here, and I'm just going to add the input search field for now because that's what we need. But you can imagine a more fully fledged search field that behaves separately. I don't know. Let's just do some borders, gray 400s, something like that. Just so it doesn't look that bad. And then let's add some margin bottom. This is just so we can see how it behaves. The look of it doesn't actually matter. If we had a search input on the page and we were searching on something and then acting on the bulk operations form, you'd see that we just lost the state of the search input, and that's not ideal. What we can do over here is we can turn our div that's wrapping the articles into a tuberFrame, and we can point the bulk form to that tuberFrame using the data tuberFrame attribute. And just like that, pretend that we have some state over here, and let's try to use the application. And sure enough, our articles were removed, but we also lost the flash message. Luckily, that's easy to fix. Inside the tuberFrame, we can check if there is a status message, and if so, we can render a tuberstream for a flash message passing the status string. So whatever was set, and remember that we are setting that in the controller, in the bulk controller over here, we are flashing some message, and yeah, we can do this. And what this is going to do is it's going to render the tuberstream element in the page inside the tuberFrame. Tuberstreams and tuberFrames are independent of each other. Let me show you what I mean. If we open this up in Tinker, I can generate a tuberstream, and I can generate, I don't know, a remove one is easy. So this will generate a tuberstream tag for me. If I generate one for the flash message, which is the macro that I have in the application, I get the same thing, just, it has more things because I defined the macro to do that. If you're curious about this macro, I have it in Workbench App Service Provider over here. This is a tuberstring to append to the notifications element, this view over here, passing the message that we passed to the macro itself. Let's try again. We remove, we got our flash message back. So it works. What I like about this approach is that now my controllers, they are actually playing Laravel controllers. There's nothing tuber related in these controllers. My tuber related code is only in the view. So using this approach, you don't actually think about, well, how do I test this behavior? Well, you're not using anything that fancy to test with. You can just spin up a test and submit some requests to this and see that it was redirected. There's nothing tuber specific in this redirect. The tuber specific logic is self-contained within your views. So yeah, it's just one more way. I like this approach because of the way it works, and you may prefer to keep the tuber related stuff in the front end. So, and most of the time you're able to do that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to show y'all. I hope you learned a few new things. We learned how to change the form behavior based on which submit button you pressed, and also how to bind inputs that are not rendered inside the form to the form itself, which is pretty cool. We also learned how to keep our controllers boring, like the Rails folks say. And by that I mean just, plain Laravel stuff. There's nothing tuber specific in the backend code. It's only in the front end code. Yeah, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.